Russia is outperforming the US in the race for global influence. That is the latest assessment from the Pentagon. Has Donald Trump set the stage for Russia's return and the revival of a multipolar world order? Hello and welcome to Bigger Than Five with me, Rida Fakhri. It's no secret that US President Donald Trump has always sought warm ties with Russia. He's repeatedly praised Russian President Vladimir Putin, despite US intelligence agencies pointing to Moscow's interference in the 2016 US election. In their recent meeting at the G20 summit in Japan, the two leaders made light of these allegations, saying that they will focus instead on expanding bilateral political and economic ties and will begin consultations on nuclear arms control. Meanwhile, here in Washington, the Pentagon says the US is underestimating the scope of Russia's global rise. In a new study, the US Department of Defense warns that the US is ill-equipped to counter what it calls Russia's increasingly brazen political warfare across Europe, Central Asia, Africa, and Latin America, urging the United States to step up its game. In a few moments, we'll be speaking with James Woolsey, former head of the CIA, about the divisions between the White House and the US intelligence community on how to address Russia's growing influence. But first, the view from Moscow and what Russians think about their country's re-emergence on the international stage.
Чтобы все, во-первых, признали Россию как сильная держава. А я думаю, Европа и Америка не хотят этого. Хотят видеть Россию слабую. Он вот вопрос, я думаю так, он хочет, так как сейчас все вышли против России, он хочет этот вопрос решать мирным путем. И они, Европа и Америка хотят повлиять хотя бы на экономику через санкции, через что-то, что Путин как-то с ними уже начал по-другому разговаривать. Мир принимает Россию как военная держава. Я так думаю, это страна, которая хочет завоевать весь мир. Но это не так, по крайней мере, я так думаю. Это страна, которая хочет развиваться, быть великой державой и остаться великой.
Мне кажется, первая его задача это обеспечить безопасность и стабильность, потому что за последние 100 лет, предыдущие 100 лет, страна 3 раза подверглась агрессии. Это Первая мировая война, Вторая мировая война и так называемый коллапс или краш, вот развал Союза, который тоже не прошел без вмешательства извне. Это не сам по себе Союз развалился. И мы каждый раз возрождались. То есть было плохо, возрождались, было плохо, возрождались, было плохо, ужасно. Мы возрождались, и сейчас какая-то стабильность. Вот он старается, потому что если у нас будет стабильность вовне, то есть на внешних границах, то внутри мы сможем получить хороший результат. Извне ничего. То есть у нас есть своя позиция, мы отстаиваем ее, не лезем никуда, не хотим вмешаться ни в чье-либо другое. То есть он защищает интересы в первую очередь России и нашего народа.
Президент Путин, он прежде всего защитник своей страны и интересов России. Прежде всего, он заботится о народе Российской Федерации. Поэтому все его действия я оправдываю. Он хочет достичь равноправия, чтобы Россию равноправно, как полноценного партнера, воспринимали на Западе. Во-вторых, Россия имеет право иметь свой голос в мире, к которому должны все прислушиваться, и в то же время быть со всеми странами в равных отношениях.
Well, that's the view from Moscow. For more on Russia's global rise, I'm joined by Ambassador James Woolsey, who was the director of the U.S. Central Intelligence Agency, the CIA, from 1993 to 1995. Ambassador Woolsey, the Russians obviously see their country's re-emergence on the international stage as a matter of nationalism and pride. A view that is obviously not shared here in Washington, where many politicians and lawmakers see the growing assertiveness of Moscow with deep skepticism and suspicion, much of it having to do with the fact that the CIA and other intelligence agencies have concluded that the Russians have interfered in the last election to help Donald Trump become president. Where do you stand as former director of the CIA?
Russia meddles in everybody's business. It's not just ours. They have been doing this since the whole disinformatia program started in the 20s and 30s. The Russians are very committed to meddling in their neighbors' affairs. It's not just us, it's Western Europe, it's Eastern Europe, it's throughout that part of the world.
Sure, so something that many people around the world will say the United States has done for decades. But before moving on to that, are you saying unequivocally, are you saying that the Russians have indeed helped Donald Trump become president?
You'll have to ask the Russians that.
What do you say as former CIA
Russia
director?
generally meddles in whatever it can find. Whether they meddled precisely in something on such and such a day with such and such a target, I don't know. But they're always meddling. The
January 2017 assessment by intelligence agencies, including the CIA and the FBI, was very clear in its finding. It said, quote, Russian President Vladimir Putin ordered an influence campaign in 2016 aimed at the US presidential election. Is this assessment, in your opinion, right or wrong?
I don't know whether it's precisely correct or not, but the general thrust of taking account of Russia's meddling is accurate. The Russians have been doing this from time immemorial. They are never not meddling. So there's nothing surprising about it.
But so you disagree with the president, because he obviously emphatically denies that they meddled to help him in the election.
What the president has said did not occur was that there was no effect. That is, they did not succeed in changing a vote, that sort of thing. But not taking part in their usual meddling. The Russians wouldn't know how to behave if they weren't meddling in some neighbor's business.
Okay, well, let's put it in perspective. Trump was elected by something like 79,000 votes in 3 states. That was the margin, in states like Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, and Michigan. Do you think it is conceivable that the election meddling, the influence campaign online that the Russians put together in 2016 could have influenced those 79,000 votes that actually ended putting Trump in the White House?
Our analysts in the United States who studied this in substantial detail and done testimony on Capitol Hill and the rest tend to say no, that it did not affect the outcome. But they are all more or less, in one way or another, on the side of those who do believe that the Russians meddled the way they've meddled for decades in the past.
Well, they don't say no unequivocally, but I'm asking you as former CIA director, and I'm asking you, taking into account some of the House Select Committee on Intelligence findings and what they believe the Russian online campaign looked like. They compared it to a troll farm. Take Facebook alone, 11.4 million Americans exposed to Russian-sponsored ads. Twitter, about 288 million impressions of tweets by Russian-linked bots. I'm asking you, is it possible? Is it even probable that this might have influenced enough voters to sway the election in Trump's favor?
It doesn't look to all of the American analysts as if it swayed the election, but it looks to almost all of them as if the Russians intervened rather strongly, the way they have many times in the past. We're going to have to teach them a lesson here at some point and make life very unhappy for them.
You said this in the past when you were asked if the United States also interferes in foreign elections. You said, sure, the US has done it too, but, quote, only for a very good cause,
yes,
in the interest of democracy.
Right.
Is it for the United States government to determine what kind of governance other countries have, what kind of political and economic system they choose?
People can make the decisions themselves. But
if
you don't care about the difference between tyranny and freedom, then you are pretty much a typical Russian.
But is it really about tyranny and freedom? Is this
Yes.
really in the pursuit of democracy? Because for decades, the United States has been trying to put in power leaders that suit their interests, both economic and political.
It's very much about tyranny and freedom. And Russia has stood on the side, except under Alexander II, bless his soul, Russia has basically stood on the side of tyranny for decade after decade after decade, and it's standing on the side of tyranny today.
So you're saying it's okay when the United States does it, but not when Russia does it. This is again yet another example
It is
of
very
US exceptionalism and double standards that
It is
much of the
very
world
much
rejects.
not okay when a tyranny does it, and Russia is a tyranny of the worst sort today.
And so what do you say to those who will point to the very well documented cases of the coups that have been fomented by the CIA in the 50s and the 60s to overthrow democratically elected leaders? Mossadegh of Iran comes to mind, Allende of Chile, and there are many more. Not to mention, not to say the obvious, that you haven't exactly pushed your closest and staunchest allies in the Gulf toward democracy in elections.
Well, we do what we can when we can to help enhance the role of democracy and the rule of law in the world. Russia does what it can, whenever it can, to oppose the rule of law and democracy. And consequently, we clash up against one another in one way or another from time to time. And we will continue to do so unless Russia starts pulling together governments run by people like Alexander II instead of bad guys.
But would you agree, Mr. Woolsey, that if the US wants indeed to stop foreign interference in its elections, and the 2020 elections are around the corner, it should be the first to adhere to such principle? Because I'll mention a study that was released by the Carnegie Mellon University that found that between 1946 and 2000, the United States meddled at least 81 times in 45 countries compared to the Soviet Union and Russian interferences in some 36 instances, and that is only until 2000.
When the issue is freedom versus tyranny, we will work with our friends. Russia, in those same elections, is working with tyrants. Russia can't seem to do anything in government in its involvement except work with tyrants.
So if that is the case,
its
then
way.
why is President Trump so close to President Putin, if he is
I
the
don't know
tyrant
that he
you
is
suggest
close to President Putin.
Well, he's been defending him at every turn.
He shakes his hand, he smiles. Diplomacy often requires people to get along cordially with those whom they don't think highly of. We were allied for 3 years and 8 months in World War II with Joseph Stalin, who was the greatest murderer in the history of humanity to that point. Mao Zedong passed him a few years later. But
he's done more than just shake his hand. He has stood with the Russian president against his own national intelligence agencies, including the CIA.
Needs to pay attention to exactly what he says and does.
That is precisely what he said. He said he stands with what the Russian president told him. He undermined the findings of the U.S. intelligence agencies, including the CIA.
Roosevelt hugged Stalin and called him Uncle Joe. Sometimes in diplomacy, one has to swallow a bit and be at least cordial with tyrants such as Putin and Stalin.
How does it make you feel, though, that President Trump and the Justice Department have now flipped the tables over and have decided to investigate the investigators? They're undermining the authority of the CIA and the FBI, wanting to investigate them in connection with the Russian investigation.
We have our backings and forthings in American politics in which people investigate all sorts of things. We have more investigative bodies than one can shake a stick at. And it's our way. And other countries, such as Russia, are afraid of what they're going to find if they tried to have an open hearing or open assessments and discussions. They could never do that, and they never will.
Ambassador James Woolsey, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Over the last decade, under President Putin, Russia has been playing an increasingly significant role in international affairs. So how did Moscow achieve its global comeback? Aus Haidari has our 5 facts.
Russia's global rise has been facilitated by a number of policies taken on by the Kremlin, starting with growing economic footprint. In 2014, Russia established the Eurasian Economic Union. This integrated single market union includes over 183 million people, spans 15% of the world's landmass, and generates a gross domestic product of over $4 trillion. Cultivating friendly neighbors. Through political parties, politicians, and business elites, Russia has established strong ties with many of its neighbors, extending debt relief, financial bailout, favorable trade terms, and discounts on oil and gas exports. Kyrgyzstan was offered more than $1.5 billion in loans, write-offs, and grants in exchange for shutting down the US's only military base in the region. And in 2013, Ukraine was offered $15 billion in a bailout package. Dominating the information space, Moscow employs many traditional and digital media tools to promote its interests and influence public opinion regionally and globally. According to a report released by Democrats on the House Intelligence Committee about the 2016 US elections, Russian operatives produced more than 3,300 targeted Facebook ads with more than 11 million American users exposed. The report also suggested there were 36,000 Russian-linked Twitter accounts that generated 288 million impressions. Expanding military and security cooperation. In 1992, Russia established the Collective Security Treaty Organization. This military alliance enabled Moscow to preserve a military presence in former Soviet states. It also paved the way for military bases in Armenia and Kyrgyzstan. Today, Russia has an additional 8 military bases around the world: Belarus, Georgia, Kazakhstan, Moldova, Tajikistan, Ukraine, Syria, and most recently in the Arctic. Stepping up diplomatic efforts. Since 2014, Russia has increased its diplomatic activities around the world. It has forged military, political, and economic partnerships with China, Iran, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, India, and several other East Asian nations. Moscow has also sponsored several peace negotiations on the future of Syria, Serbia, Kosovo, and Afghanistan.
To discuss Russia's global rise, I'm joined by James Carden, contributing writer at The Nation magazine. James also served as an advisor on Russia policy at the US State Department, and Matthew Craning, Deputy Director at the Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security. He's also the author of The Return of Great Power Rivalry, Democracy versus Autocracy, From the Ancient World to the United States, Russia, and China Today. Matthew Craning, in its latest study, the Pentagon issued a warning to the political leadership here in Washington, saying that Russia is outmaneuvering the United States on the world stage. Does the US have to step up its game or simply get used to this new reality?
Well, I think the United States needs to step up its game. The national security strategy, national defense strategy say the return of great power rivalry with Russia and China is the foremost threat facing the country. China, in many ways, is the greater long-term challenge, but Russia could be the more dangerous challenge in the near term. It's invaded its neighbors, established itself as a Middle East power broker, is intervening to undermine democracy in Europe and in the United States.
But Russia would argue it's merely following its and pursuing its interests the way the United States does.
Well, I think Russia is pursuing its interest, but that doesn't mean it doesn't pose a threat. So Russia is pursuing its interest, but that's posing a threat to the United States and our allies. And so the United States needs to act to defend ourselves and defend our allies.
So how does the United States act, James Carden? How does it address this growing challenge and threat as the Pentagon sees it when the United States is so deeply polarized when it comes to Russia?
The United States is deeply polarized when it comes to Russia. That's true. I'm not sure that I view the solution to Russia's current resurgence on the world stage as something of a threat. I think that the United States and policymakers in particular need to begin to accept the reality that we're entering a multipolar world. And I think that the sooner we understand that the unipolar moment, such as was called in the 1990s, is behind us, the better off we'll be. I don't think that fighting a two-front Cold War between the United States and China on the one hand and the United States and Russia on the other serves the interests of the United States, and certainly I don't think it serves the interests of peace and stability around the world.
Is it in the interest of the rest of the world to have a resurgent Russia that is more closely aligned with China, the resurgence of countries like India and other regional powers?
No, I think most of the rest of the world, including India, would be better off under U.S. leadership. If we look over the past 70 years with U.S. leadership, we've seen unprecedented levels of prosperity, good governance and freedom around the world, lack of great power rivalry and conflict. Now with the resurgence of Russia and China, all of those things are being called into question.
But they've also seen unprecedented sanctions and threats of war.
Against countries violating international law and challenging the system, countries like Iraq, North Korea, and Iran pursuing nuclear weapons, sponsoring international terrorism. So yes, those countries have been under sanction and under threat, but it's because they're problematic. And India is the country you mentioned. They're actually moving closer to the United States because they're very concerned about Chinese behavior.
The Pentagon seems particularly concerned about China's growing alliance with Russia. Is it, though, for the benefit of the rest of the world to have these two powers counterbalance the weight of the United States?
I think if Russia and China, they've been obviously pushed together more closely in the aftermath of 2014 when the United States and the West sanctioned Russia for its actions in Ukraine. I'm not sure that that serves U.S. national security interests. I tend to think...
But does it benefit the rest of the world, the developing world?
I simply don't believe that the way that the Pentagon report portrays the so-called Russian threat is accurate. It certainly would serve the purposes of the Pentagon and the Pentagon budget and the American military, media, industrial complex, but I'm not sure that Russia has this great grand strategy to take over the world, subvert American democracy and the rest of it. I think a lot of what they've done is actually reactive.
Reactive, being provoked, the Russians would say, by NATO expansion into the former Soviet republics like Georgia and Ukraine.
If you look at the small countries in Eastern Europe, they should get a voice too. And they decided they were tired living under Russian domination. They wanted to be part of the West, wanted to be part of NATO. And so I think those countries' decisions and sovereignty need to be respected as well. And Russia doesn't respect their sovereignty. It's invaded two of its neighbors.
Well, James Carden, for someone who's worked at the State Department, the Pentagon study now also suggests that the State Department should have a more aggressive influence policy toward Russia to make sure that it doesn't build this alliance with other countries that could be to the detriment of the United States. Is it time for the United States to admit that Russia isn't going to change under the threat of sanctions?
Yeah, I think that sounds reasonable.
And how?
Well, for one thing, I think that we need to rethink our approach regarding the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. I think that if we ignore the fact that NATO expansion has served as something of kind of the origin story of this new Cold War, we didn't take into consideration Russian objections in the 90s and in the 2000s when we were busy expanding the alliance right up to Russia's eastern borders. I respectfully disagree with your assertion that Russia redrew the map of Europe at gunpoint. They weren't the first country to do that. Obviously, the Kosovo bombing in 1999 set the precedent for redrawing the map of Europe at gunpoint for the first time since World War II. So I think that we're not so innocent, and I think that it's hard to look at the track record of the United States, particularly in the post-Cold War era, and simply ignore the fact that in a lot of cases, unfortunately, and it pains me to say this, we've been the aggressor.
Well, I respectfully disagree with that. The United States certainly hasn't been perfect, but let's look at this period of U.S. leadership compared to any other period in world history. And I think it's very hard to compare. Again, the peace, the prosperity, the freedom, better today than at any point in world history. So not perfect, but what is the alternative?
Well, not just not perfect, but imposing its will on many other countries. And would you accept that Russia isn't simply displaying the way the US sees it, mischief around the world, but it's actually looking for a measure of respect as a great nuclear power?
I think that certainly is one of Russia's objectives. It wants to be seen as a great power on the world stage. It wants it so that no major international security issue can be decided without Russia at the table. But I think their ambitions outstrip their capabilities. Again, they're a declining power. Their economy is racked with corruption. I think that other than nuclear weapons and energy, Russia doesn't have much to offer to the rest of the world.
A declining power, isn't that exactly what the US is?
Well, I was going to say, it seems like part of your description of Russia sounds an awful lot like the United States at the moment. And I wish it weren't so, but it is. And I think part of the reason is that we've overstretched ourselves globally. And I think that if we took a more humble approach, if we took a more, if we could come to if we could just accept that the world is changing and become better, a better neighbor, a global neighbor, I think we'd be a lot better off. I simply don't see Russia as this great global boogeyman that the Pentagon study has portrayed.
James Carden and Matthew Koenig, thank you both very much indeed.
Thank you.
Thank you. And so by putting America first and withdrawing the US from its traditional global leadership role, President Trump may have inadvertently handed President Putin a great advantage. He may also have done the international system an important favor by allowing the emergence of old and new powers ready to compete with the US in a more evenly distributed playing field. From me, Rida Fakhri, and all the team here in Washington, thanks for watching. See you next time.